staying at places for 25 years. They want something with portability. The newer worker, the millennial, we'll just call it, they don't really understand pensions, from what I understand, from what people who are in this business are telling me. And if you really look at it, if you look at the last 2 employees that left our organization, they both left for a defined contribution pension. Both of them. And they had a defined benefit here. And really, I mean, at the end of the day, really not much money increase for either of them going forward. Maybe a little more opportunity, being in bigger communities, but it really, I mean, so the trend, I mean, the trend is kind of what we're seeing, because I mean, the last 2 employees we had went to places that have DCs.
It didn't stop them from.
Didn't stop.
What's the percentage of defined contribution versus defined benefit today?
It's a good question. So, MERS is still a majority defined benefit, and I say that with the caveat that there's about 850 municipalities of all shapes and sizes in MERS. There are a lot of open defined benefit plans, like the city has today. There are also a lot of plans that are closed, meaning that the folks that had the defined benefit, they keep the defined benefit, but then new hires come in to defined contribution. So it's not scientific. If I had to calculate it based on those situations, open or closed DB, I'd say it's probably about 70% DB and 30% defined contribution, but the defined contribution number is growing. We also have a lot of communities that are joining the MERS plan that have historically run their own plan, offer defined benefit. Their decision is that they're going to move out of the defined benefit. They're handing the administration over to MERS. They're moving forward with defined contribution. It's really, I think, at the end of the day, though, and then there's some in the not too distant, too far from where we're standing here that have very strong defined benefit plans, probably the biggest one being Kent County, who I know leverages it quite well. So there are definitely examples and good examples that are out there that have that as well. So I think the recruitment and the retention piece is really a very important piece to consider here, because if the plan that you have in place today isn't working, then you want something that will recruit and retain people in there. This plan has a 10-year vesting. I have seen some impacts like Mike is describing there too. 10 years is a long time to work at a place, in order to lock in a lifetime benefit. Same, but the flip side is 10 years is, you start getting 10 years plus, you've got a lot of experience, you don't really want to let that person go. So there's some advantages from training and things like that. So it's all about getting that right fit. And that was really why I wanted to share the information on page 12. There is no one size fits all. There really isn't. As much as I would love to say, like, just do this and you're great and all your dreams will come true, that just won't happen that way. So I think it's about, and I think Mike's already got a good strategy from what we've talked about, at least at a high level, of trying to hit things in a couple different ways based on the specific needs for future city employees and being respectful for the budget, both now and in the future.
There's a year, about 20 years from now, about 18, 19 years from now, where the way we're doing it today, roughly 1/3, in today's dollars, 1/3 of expenditures out of the general fund will be pension unfunded liabilities.
It's going to take us down.
Yes.
That's why we have to fix it.
It's got to be fixed. No.
I will share, the Light and Power Board has looked at our pension plan over the course of the last 6-7 months, and I believe it was July, we had a meeting to discuss options for us for the future, and there was a consensus, no formal action, but a consensus during an open meeting to switch to a defined contribution plan. And they had charged me to poll other Michigan municipal electric utilities for what they would contribute to a DC plan, and I can share those numbers with you later, but there was a consensus to move forward with a DC plan for Lowell Light and Power. On a separate note, I do have a question though for you, Michael. I know Lowell Power has to report our pension fund with the city's pension fund for like state emergency action plan purposes. And I've read the bill. In the bill it states that we're considered in the emergency status if we're below 60% and if more than 10% of our expenditures go towards the pension plan. Now Lowell Power's $9 million utility, 10% of $9 million is $900,000. So if you take the city and Lowell Power's costs, we're going to be under 10%. So that would keep us out.
Correct.
If we look at it that way, or do you know if the state looks at light power separate from the city, or are we allowed to combine? Because if we're combining, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're going to have over 10% to trigger that.
It's just you guys keeping us afloat.
True, but I'm not sure of the repercussions. I mean, obviously you want to fix the problem, and I'm not suggesting we don't, but there's probably a lot of compliance and ancillary issues as soon as you trigger that.
Yeah, my understanding, Steve, is you do have the ability to separate them out basically through information from your audit. I can get you more information. I'm not too familiar with all the details here, but I believe you have that ability. The other piece that you mentioned for state oversight, Mike mentioned earlier that 60% is the threshold the state of Michigan has established. If you're at or below that level, you're on a list, if you will, and then you have to tell your story. Everyone has to tell their story annually to the state of Michigan Department of Treasury. If you fall below that level, you have to do a little more. You have to say what you're doing to address those issues and how you're trying to change the cost curve, move it up, over time. Depending on the type of entity that you are. So if a city falls in one category, light and power falls under another category. Not my terms, that's theirs. So from the city standpoint, if you're below 60% funded or you're paying more than 10% of your city revenues to the pension plan, then you're on the naughty list, I'll call it. For light and power, it's just 60% funded. It doesn't matter how much your pension contribution costs are. I can say that the legislature, in conjunction with Treasury, is actively looking at that because they have recognized that there should be uniformity in how that is applied across the state, whether you're a road commission, a light and power, public works, what have you, and not segregating folks out into different categories. So they're looking at it. I'm not a betting person, so I can't say for sure that they're going to update that, but I feel like they will. So that if you are under 60%, like your contributions don't exceed the 10%, you're still okay and you don't go on that watch list. So that's something that they're looking at right now. But again, where that all shuffles out at the end of the day, we'll see.
Sure.
And the other piece, I'll get you some information on.
Okay, one other, if it's all right with the council, one other question I have, and I know you're not the actuary, you probably didn't make the decisions as a result of the experience study, but maybe you have some insider information or can share something. When I look at the investment income that on page 5 in that chart, I know it's the rolling average, but if I take 7% approximately of our valuation of our asset balance, on the average, I should see an average of return $490,000 when we have $7 million in the plan, and then $8 million in the plan, $560, $9 million, $630.
Yep.
I'm not seeing that. We've had the greatest bull run in the history of the United States.
Yep.
And I'm using 7% return. So how did they come up with 735 if they haven't gotten 735 in the last decade?
Yeah, a great question, and it's a difficult one. So that calculation is complex. It's not quite as straightforward as that, but I get exactly where you're coming from. How did they come up with 735? They take a look at the system as a whole. The number of retirees that there's obligations to pay for. In a retirement system, there's an obligation to pay those retirees. They've been promised something. There has to be money there. There's also state and federal regulations that, I'll say limit, but guide what a public sector investment team can invest in. You can't go all in on Apple or Samsung or something like that. You have to have diversified categories. So there's a balance between cash on hand, preserving that cash, the ability to pay for retirees, at the same time needing to participate, in the market. So MERS is a more defensive portfolio in nature. It's never, and I don't have, I can give you the stats, I don't have them here with me. You'll never see it soar as high as, the S&P 500, think 2009, 2010, phenomenal returns when you had, the government buying back bonds. The market was going crazy after the market had just fallen through the floor. The market went really well if you stayed in the market. MERS had good returns. They didn't have the highest level of returns because it's a globally diversified portfolio, so it's designed if one area is down, there's another area that goes up. So all of that being considered, they also take a look at, if you look back on page 9, I can tell you that stats, just like you see on page 9, are what our board wrestled with, because frankly, they've received a lot of feedback on both sides saying that, MERS long-term, historically, MERS rate of return assumption was 8%. Historically, over a 30-year period of time, MERS has returned 9%. The last 10 years now, if you drop off 2008, we're north of 8%. But if you cut the time frame down a little shorter, I mentioned last year we lost 4%, 4 years ago we lost 1%. There's a lot more volatility in the market. The Federal Reserve is in the marketplace and having an impact on things. And there's a lot of concern about, some folks will say, just go really conservative. Lower the number down to 4% and hit it out of the park every single year. Other folks say you're long-term investors, you should keep it at 8% because long-term you're going to hit that number because that's what you historically have hit. And I can say that was probably the most critical decision and the most difficult decision our board had to make of where do you put that number based on the outlook for the future, the need for cash, and frankly, the impact on local governments if you lower that assumption. So when I reference page 9, if you look under that column that says lower future annual returns, and it says 575, so that's a more conservative assumption than what's currently in play. That's a 2% more conservative assumption than what is currently used. If you look at the impact on the funding level and the contribution, it's significant. And you really have to balance, not overreacting to market changes, but then at the same time not underreacting to them as well. So I would argue that going too low would be A, irresponsible, and B, would probably force everyone to shut the doors, frankly, at a level like that. So 735 is a lot of slicing and dicing once they had an area that they felt comfortable with, and then it was a matter of just really, honing in on that particular amount. So it's a difficult conversation. I know, again, from talking to our board members, we changed our assumption 4 years ago. Historically, it was at 8. It had never been changed. And in 2014, we changed from 8 to 7.75, where it currently stands today. And then 4 years later, I'm addressing council and saying, hey, we're going from 775 to 735. Pushes plant costs out. Not a fun conversation, just being honest. And I know the board would love nothing more than to say that that's where it stays, and we don't have to make that change again, because it's all about getting that number right. If they have to make a change again and it lowers, then this conversation takes place all over again. So there's a lot of concern about trying to get it right. And so with the highest degree of confidence based on MERS investment portfolio and our asset allocation model, they felt longer term, so I'm talking the 8-10 year time frame, that a 7.35 could be attained without taking an inordinately high amount of risk. The question being, how does it all? Time will tell. Time will tell.
Mike, is
Yeah.
MERS, there's talk in city manager world about how supposedly is MERS having a conversation right now about reducing the rate of return much quicker? Because from what I'm hearing, at least with our manager talking, that we're going to go to the 7.35, but maybe shortly thereafter there's going to be another change.
No.
Okay.
100% honest with you, no. Now, I'm not saying that would never happen. There is no active or inactive conversation that's going on that says, let's do this. There is no desire to revisit that unless it demands that. We are at about 8.5% today, year to date for 2019. That's good news for me to be able to share. What matters is where we're at on December 31st. So I don't want to get overconfident. I'd rather be in this spot than down, but it matters where we're at. So absolutely, it would be something that they would have the responsibility to look at again should the need arise. Boy, if that doesn't have to be looked at, there is no desire to take that on again. The state is at 7% currently. The state's uniform assumption for state oversight is 7%. And I think that has caused some concern in that area, saying, well, if the state is saying that 7% is the number, you know, MERS, are you just taking your time to get there? And that's a fair question to ask. And again, I can say there's no desire to go there unless the data supports it. But they're looking at this every single year. So string a couple negative years in a row, and I can very well see that being taken again. But honestly, that's not on the agenda right now.
Thank you. Question, you mentioned Kent County's doing much better with their defined benefit package. Were they in much better shape where they were 90% instead of our 63%? How are they doing so much better?
Yeah, so they're not a system that I work with, so they're an independently run one. From my very limited research with them, they have had a plan that is at or near fully funded, almost 100% for years, decades, which is, they've just been able to keep it at that level. Now, they made tweaks and changes. Again, I don't know it intimately well, but they're probably the biggest one that has a solid plan, and it's got all of the assets that it needs right now. But they've made tweaks and changes, moved to a more conservative assumption set too. It's just, I think, a little bit easier to do that when you're, fully paid up versus having a legacy debt that needs to be dealt with. Their challenge is they're dealing with one plan, so when their pension board makes a change, it's them that has to deal with it. MERS is considering the impact on 750 municipalities that have defined benefit that are funded from 200% down to 30, 40, 50%, and the impact that has across the board on all of them. So it's a very dynamic decision. Last piece, I did include my contact information, but I'm guessing that probably the best approach, if there are questions or Mike Hockey would like to handle it, I'm glad to answer questions that council may have at any point in time, or run those through Mike, and I'm glad to get you answers back in writing or however you would prefer. So our role in this, my role in this, is just to facilitate, give you the information. I want to see you get to a place where it's sustainable and it feels right. So that's our short-term goal to work through all this, and that's what we stand ready to do for you.
No, this is very helpful and educational. Thanks for bringing that in. Open our eyes up to the problem that we got.
Any other questions for Mike?
Have we been
Or Mike?
in MERS only since 2008, or have we been in it longer?
We've been in MERS probably since the city was, I would assume, since the
Okay.
city was incorporated.
All right.
We've been in MERS for a very long time. There were periods of time where we were.
Were we ever
Yeah.
funded? That's where I was.
We were
going.
we were probably about 100%. I want to say we were close to 100% around 2002, 2003, before the economy went south. We were in a good position over time. It's gone down and gone down and gone down. Quite honestly, until really has never been addressed until the last 2-3 years.
And the city's been in since 1968.
Thank you.
One last quick question, and you had briefly touched on it, that is it the state that governs what MERS can or can't invest in? Because, and again, I don't want to be like Monday morning quarterback, but if I look at the history of the United States, the S&P has always gone up.
Yeah.
It just, and if we're bullish on America, the expectation would always be that it goes up. So why not just simply let it ride with the S&P?
I agree with you, that would be more my personal philosophy of setting.
Because that's what most,
Yeah.
if you go to any portfolio manager, Roth IRA, 457,
Yeah.
just dollar cost average, 450, in the S&P, and you're gonna be better off by the time you're 60.
Yeah, I think it goes, Steve, you're right, like a long term, it goes that way, but there's that more conservative, that defensive concern, of there have been market downfalls, and the need to diversify so that one asset category is up and another one is down. In the good times, gosh, I would want to be all in on that. I get it. That being said, I look back to 2008, this is an odd statement maybe to make. In 2008, full transparency, MERS lost 25%. That was the worst loss that MERS had ever experienced in over 70 years of its history. We benchmark against CalPERS, other large public sector, pension systems across the United States. And MERS was in the top 1% of loss. So it feels weird to say, well, we only lost this much, you guys lost this much. Like that's probably not a conversation that a lot of folks have, but I have folks that lost half their portfolio in that 1 year based on their asset allocation. We needed to be very, defensive. But I get it. Absolutely, the United States stock market is a critical component of it. It's definitely, we are a major player in that area. It's just not all in that. There's a well-diversified portfolio there designed to be, again, more defensive in nature. I don't know if that helps any, but I get it.
Yeah, I understand. I just didn't know if there was some law preventing, MERS from actually doing it in that
PERSIA
methodology.
is probably the biggest law, Public Employee Retirement System Investment Act.
Okay.
That determines the type of investment categories you can invest in, and then even like how much you can do, setting high-level guidelines, and then you take that to a more granular level. It's up to the board to determine, all right, what are our asset classes and how much are we going to operate within the tolerances that are predetermined by law. If you
Okay.
will. Long-winded answer.
No, thanks.
Anybody have anything else? All set? Jim?
Okay.
No, it's your turn.
Oh, I make a motion to adjourn at 7:40 or 6:45.
I'll support. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Adjourn. You're sick, sorry.